when talking about Russian politics and sports intertwined, when does it start? Is it back in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so we go back to the Soviet period, so before the Second World War in the 1920s and 30s. So at that time, in the early Soviet period, Soviet athletes did not compete in international events like the Olympics or the World Cup because the Bolshevik government saw those events and the governing bodies as bourgeois capitalist institutions, and they refused to take part. And in turn, the International Olympic Committee and FIFA saw the Bolsheviks as a revolutionary threat. So they did not participate at all in international events in the 1920s and 30s. You did have, of course, sport in the Soviet Union. There was a thriving football culture in athletics, wrestling, gymnastics, and other sport. You had a lot of activity in the Soviet Union. And something the Soviet leadership tried to do was to get its athletes, particularly in athletics, to compete towards setting world records so that they could demonstrate, even though Soviet athletes don't participate in the Olympics, they're still the best athletes in the world. So there was an emphasis on high-level competition, or I should say high-level achievement in Soviet sport in the 20s and 30s. And then it's after the war that the Soviets start to become involved in international competitions and engage with international teams in football and so forth. The Soviets participate in the Olympics for the first time in 1952 at Helsinki. And when they do this, when they enter into international competition, it is under the strict orders that come from Stalin himself that Soviet athletes must win. Stalin, in fact, said to the director of the state sport committee, if you're not going to win, there's no reason to participate. So from the beginning, when the Soviet Union becomes involved in the Olympics and other events, it's with this clear directive that Soviet athletes must show the superiority of the Soviet state and the superiority of communism as an economic and social system.
How has it been since Putin came into power in 1999? How is he and his regime use sports?
So Putin, right away, when he becomes president in the year 2000, so this is an Olympic year, the Sydney Games take place in the autumn of 2000, and Putin puts himself in charge of the committee responsible for preparing Russian athletes for the Sydney Olympics. He's chairing the meetings where they're discussing training regimens and they're discussing facilities, and he's giving orders to, add more money in this budget and pay more attention to these facilities and so forth. So he's taking a direct hand in preparations for the Olympics, seeing this as an important part of Russia's return to status as a world power, right? And right before the Russian athletes, the Russian team goes to Sydney in 2000, Putin welcomes them all to the Kremlin. They have this formal ceremony. They go to the tomb of the unknown soldier. The Orthodox archbishop blesses all the athletes, gives them all an icon. And Putin gives this speech in which he says at the end, victories in sport unite the nation more than 100 political slogans. And so Putin saw from the beginning the political importance of sport, not only importance in terms of international politics, right? So Putin will seek to have world events like the Winter Olympics, like the World Cup, World Championships, and so forth. So he seeks to use international sport as a way of extending Russian soft power. But international participation by Russians, and particularly international victories, is a way to tell the Russian people Russia is again a strong, successful country. The 90s are over, and the new Russia is here, and it's demonstrated in our sport victories.
There was a big controversy over doping and Russian athletes. Can you say more on this topic, as some athletes were banned in 2016? Due to this. So can you tell more about doping and Russian state? Right.
So the doping program goes back into the Soviet period. The Soviets began to, along with American, West European, East European athletes from other countries. But the Soviets recognized in the 60s that doping was a new scientific tool to allow their athletes to succeed. So Soviet chemists, Soviet scientists, Soviet physicians, they studied doping in depth to figure out what was the ideal dosage that you would give to athletes in particular sports, what were some of the dangers, what risks were there. So the Soviets made this part of their state-run sport program. Once we get into the 1990s, into the post-Soviet period, this tradition of doping continues, and then after Putin's presidency begins in the year 2000, you can see signs that it not only increases, but it gets wrapped into the state-run sport program. The first instance you have of Russian athletes getting caught doping was at the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, and so two Nordic skiers, cross-country skiers, tested for doping at those games. And this was the first instance when Russian officials used the strategy that they'll later use after the Sochi Games and the revelations of the Sochi Games, where they deny all of the evidence, they deny the science, right? So the chemists from the World Anti-Doping Agency say, no, this is chemistry. Your athletes failed these drug tests. And the Russian officials reply, no, it's your chemistry. It's not our chemistry. And your chemistry is suggesting we cheated when we know Russian athletes don't cheat. So this is the first step in what we will see unfold throughout the 2000s leading up to the games in 2014. And this is when the Russian anti-doping agency, so the lab intended to test athletes to make sure they're clean, they set up this system where Russian athletes who are doping at the Sochi Games will turn in their urine will get traded out for clean urine, the tests will be done showing that the Russian athletes are clean, and those will be the tests that get recorded with WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. So this is what was happening at Sochi. Of course, at the Sochi Games, Russia wins the most medals of any other country. And through various steps, the word starts to get out about the doping program that's really being run through the sport ministry and run through the top levels of the Soviet sport program. And the story really breaks open when the head of the anti-doping agency, Grigory Rodchenkov, defects, flees to the United States, and brings along all of his computer hard drives and so forth, and releases this information. There was other evidence, there were other whistleblowers, but this was the big breakthrough that reveals just how extensive the Russian doping program was and leads to the sanctions in 2016.
I'd like to move to the relation between Russia and IOC. Mm-hmm. How can Russia influence IOC? Are they good at lobbying and at influencing IOC and its decisions?
They are very good. They work the system very well. And you had a personal relationship for years between Putin and Thomas Bach, the German former president of the IOC. And he becomes president right before the Sochi Winter Games. And right away, he and Putin have this good relationship. And it's interesting that as Russia was being sanctioned and investigated on these doping issues, Russian officials and Putin himself were criticizing the World Anti-Doping Agency. They were criticizing the federations that oversee different sports that had banned Russian athletes. But Putin would not say anything bad about Thomas Bach. So clearly there was some kind of connection that these two had. How does Russia influence the IOC or maintain its good relationship with the IOC? One way is through the money that goes from Russia to the IOC, as one of my sources in my research told me, who had interactions or had positions within WADA and within the IOC. These international governing bodies are really money-moving operations where money comes in from wealthy states and then it goes out to sports federations in poorer states. And Russia understood and played well with this system of moving money into the IOC to move it out to other countries' federations. And so Russia played very well within this political dynamic, the same as you have in FIFA, right? That if you're able to build up favor with countries in South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, that is going to help you in some of the bigger decisions that happen at the IOC. So for instance, with the recent decision by the IOC to reinstate Russia for the upcoming, the games in Los Angeles in 2028, Russia had already been doing diplomatic work with countries in Africa and in South Asia and Central Asia in order to kind of build up their favor, build up their legitimacy with these countries for when things would eventually turn within the federations of individual sports and within the IOC.
And I'll be happy to talk about it in a while, but you were talking about sanctions after the doping violations. Mm-hmm. Were there any sanctions from IOC after the annexation of Crimea?
The annexation of Crimea in 2014, no, we didn't see that. So you have sanctions from international governments, correct, but there weren't sanctions that came from the IOC. The sanctions that were in place in this period from the Sochi Games to the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022 were related to the doping scandals. So the first set of sanctions in 2016, there were some adjustments in 2018 before the Winter Games in Korea. And then you had, I think it was, I'm remembering my years correctly, I think it was in 2020 that there was another slate of sanctions, which was due, it came out of the doping scandal. And what was happening is that it was found that the Russians were manipulating evidence that they needed to turn over to anti-doping officials in Switzerland to prove that they were cleaning up their own anti-doping efforts. And as it turned out, they had been completely fabricating evidence. They had been hiding evidence, and that's when they received the sanctions that were in place at the time of the Tokyo Summer Olympics.
And what happened after the full-scale invasion in 2022?
So after the full-scale invasion in 2022, it was interesting in that the IOC, and we'll have to include FIFA as a major player in world sport, these major federations, as well as the federations over other sports, they wanted to follow kind of the standard of business as usual, right? They recognized this as an extraordinary situation, but they just wanted to play a wait-and-see attitude. And the real push for strong actions against Russia came from athletes. And in particular, the real move came from football players for the Polish, the Czech, and the Swedish national teams when they said they weren't going to play against Russia in the World Cup qualifiers that were taking place. And this really put pressure on FIFA and on the International Olympic Committee to do something about the invasion when they recognized that athletes, Formula One athletes, Formula One drivers were saying as well, we're not going to race at the Grand Prix in Sochi as long as Russia is at war in Ukraine. So you have these athletes who are stepping forward, going on social media, and this forced the governing bodies to make the decision to exclude Russia from international events, from first the Paralympics, and then from the World Cup qualifiers, and then from the Olympics.
How to understand the differences in these rules at the Olympics and the Paralympics? Because this year Russians could start at the Paralympics under their flag, etc. So how do you understand these differences?
So they are different, there are different federations, right? And so initially in 2022, right after the full-scale invasion begins, the International Paralympics begin in Beijing. And the Paralympics were, the International Paralympic Committee was faced with this problem of what do we do with Russian athletes, Ukrainian athletes, many of whom are military veterans on both sides. And once again, just as with the other federations, the push came from the athletes themselves who made it clear to the International Paralympic Committee that we are not going to compete against Russian athletes. So all of these decisions, we look typically to the International Olympic Committee as the main driver of these changes. But looking at the overall landscape in terms of politics and the sport governing bodies, each of the different federations and world governing bodies, so the federations that oversee particular sports, as well as the International Paralympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee, they are in some way, they look to each other to see what are you going to do about Russia? What are you going to do about Russia? But they do act in some way independently, right? So the International Paralympic Committee was not taking its cues from the International Olympic Committee. But at the same time, there wasn't necessarily what we would say is collusion or some kind of collaboration in their decision making. But once what we've seen this winter and this spring, once federations begin to make the decision to reinstate Russian athletes, the other federations follow suit, with some exceptions, right? There are some federations that still do not want Russian athletes involved. There are some countries that do not want Russian athletes involved in the Olympics.
Finally, now let's move to the latest situation. What are your thoughts on the decision of the IOC from last week?
I think it's understandable what the IOC did. One of the ways that Russia was successful in getting the IOC and the different federations to reinstate Russian athletes, Russia was very successful in their legal campaign at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Switzerland, where Russian lawyers would point out that this exclusion of Russian athletes violates the IOC's own charters. And so on legal grounds, on the grounds of human rights, so even though, Russia's record on human rights and the rule of law is questionable at best, they used those principles to work against the International Olympic Committee and other federations to say it's not justifiable that you allow us or that you keep us out of international competition. So they were very effective in doing that. And so it was clear that this was going to break. The other thing that brought a change was Israel's military action in Gaza. And it became clear, so even during the Summer Olympics in Paris in July 2024, Israel was engaging in airstrikes in Gaza. And so once you have this other military situation that's in the headlines, and you have people such as the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez saying, how can we exclude Ukraine and we don't exclude Israel? This made the position of the IOC really untenable, that they could continue to keep out Russia while not having sanctions against Israel. So it became clear in terms of legal diplomatic grounds that this was no longer going to work. As far as my view, in looking at the history of Russia's, and before that the Soviet Union's, involvements in world sport, what I found in my research has been a consistent pattern of cheating in competition under this charge that Russian athletes must win. Russian athletes must win no matter the cost, no matter what is done to ensure that victory. And what I found in looking in Russian media and looking in the statements of Russian officials, there still is no sign that Russian sports officials and government officials, and there's great interconnection between the political elite, the oligarchs, and Russian sports authorities. They're all mixed up together. There's no indication that they have really, admitted to in terms of doping, admitted to their faults, admitted to the fact that this was a state-run program. It was connected with the Ministry of Sport. It was connected with the FSB. There's been no admission to this. Instead, this is simply seen as an unjust punishment that is brought against Russia, and Russia has been successful in remedying this unjust punishment, in removing these sanctions. So I see no sign that Russia is going to engage in any way in clean sport, in fair sport in the future, because they've never acknowledged their guilt in cheating in the past.
Is it Putin's victory?
Exactly. It's Putin's victory, right? And in Putin's mindset, right, there's only, remember, Putin was a judo athlete. He competed in judo, and, you know, he did apply the philosophy of judo, right? He'd like to say that, you know, even when you have a stronger opponent or a bigger opponent, you can use their strength to your advantage. And in diplomacy and politics, Putin has really been a judo master in you know, using other people's strengths and weaknesses against them, and he's succeeded in getting Russia back into international competition.
The very last question: how can we imagine the Olympics in 2028 in LA when you said there are still federations and athletes and even countries who just don't wish to have Russia at the Olympics? How can we imagine the situation? Are there going to be boycotts from the countries, from the athletes, from the federations? As this morning I spoke with the vice president of Biathlon Union, and he told me our statement is still clear, and I don't think it would change, that we do not want Russian athletes at the Olympics. How can we imagine the next Olympics?
So this is a terrific question, right? So you have some sports such as biathlon, which was, you know, one sport in which Russian cheating was just, it was rampant, right? And so in sports like that, they don't want to go back to this situation where we're always having to watch out for, we're having to have extra policing for the Russian athletes to make sure they don't cheat. Or with, you have 11 countries in Europe that say, we do not want the Russians back, right? So the countries such as the Czech Republic that have experienced Russian occupation or Russian threats, they don't want the Russians back. I think, I don't know what it will be like. I will say the atmosphere that we saw in Paris 2 years ago, which was just a wonderful, wonderful Olympics in my mind. And I had friends who, I wasn't able to go, I had friends who were there. They said it was just fantastic. The Paris Olympics set records for the most attendance of any Olympics. They set records for TV viewing, right? So the Paris Olympics really brought the Olympics back in terms of being this international festival, this international celebration. And the sad thing, I think, is bringing Russia back. You know, the 2028 games will still be, it'll be fun to watch, and we'll see, you know, outstanding performances and so forth. But I think a measure of the joy, even watching on television, we experienced in 2024, is going to be diminished because there will be this cloud of, okay, now we have the Russians back, who have been proven to be cheaters and have engaged in all of these political maneuvers surrounding sport. And so I think it will bring diminish in some way how much we can all enjoy the games.
Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you for having me.